Good evening, everybody. Welcome to Debating Europe. My name's Giles Merritt. I'm the Secretary General of Friends of Europe, of which Debating Europe is a very important part. And this evening we have two very distinguished panelists, adversaries. I'm not sure how to describe them, but on my right, John Bruton, former Irish Taoiseach, and also a member of Friends of Europe's Presidium of Trustees. And on my left, Bill Cash, who is, I think it's safe to say, a household name in Britain. He's a Member of Parliament who chairs the UK House of Commons European Scrutiny Committee, which is what it sounds like. It's fairly threatening. What we're going to be talking about is what would a collapse of the euro look like. And I think what I'd like to signal my questions right now, first of all, how likely do John and Bill think it is? Secondly, how damaging if it were to happen, because my sense, and I thought it emerged very much during today's roundtable discussion, the political elite are worried. They understand that we're in a very serious situation, but I wonder to what extent public opinion understands, to what extent the media have really explained the potential damage of a collapse of the euro. And it would be good, I think, during our debate, we've got over half an hour, if we could talk about if the euro were to collapse, who would suffer most. And by that I don't only mean countries, although we know that countries outside the Eurozone are not necessarily going to be insulated from the shock waves, but also in society, who would be the first to suffer and how badly. But let's begin with the possibility, question mark, probability of a collapse of the European single currency. John.
Well, I think the problem we're facing at the moment is certainly one where there's a possibility of the euro breaking up. It's a possibility, it's definitely not a probability. But that's only one expression of a deeper problem. The deeper problem that we see is the loss that has occurred of confidence in sovereign debt in all of the Western countries. We've seen an increase in the yield on US bonds, we've seen a deterioration in the credit rating of the United States because there is some doubt in the market as to whether eventually the US will be able to pay back all its debts. We also see in the United Kingdom a very substantial current account deficit and a very substantial debt and deficit problem. And we're seeing that in the Eurozone as well. Now, in absolute terms, the Eurozone's deficit and debt is actually less than the debt and deficit situation in aggregate of the United States, proportionate to its GDP, and in the UK, proportionate to its GDP. But because the euro and its policy of not allowing inflation applies, the Eurozone operates in accordance with a sort of gold standard. In other words, you can't use inflation to get yourself out of debt problems, whereas there has been substantial quantitative easing in the United States, and the UK authorities are also essentially printing money a lot more than is the case in Europe. So the problem of lack of confidence, the collision, if you like, is occurring first in Europe. But it's a global problem of debt and deficits, and indeed a loss of confidence in banks. If you think about it, if every person who has money on deposit in any bank, be it the strongest bank in the world, were to arrive on the doorstep of that bank and look for their money tomorrow, that bank, every bank would collapse. If you think about it, what's money? Money is a piece of paper. It's a piece of paper based on a promise. And if people doubt the promise implicit in that you will be able to get goods to a certain value in return for that inherently valueless piece of paper, if that doubt was sown in people's minds, money itself will collapse. So what we're essentially facing at the present time, I think, isn't only a crisis of confidence in the euro, it's a crisis of confidence in money, it's a crisis of confidence in banks, and it's a crisis of confidence in governments and their ability to meet their obligations. So we've got to resolve the thing globally as well as resolving it in Europe.
Thank you. Bill Cash, the UK political narrative, as I understand it, seems to have been, we told you so. We warned you against the euro. We're very glad that we, the UK, are not in it. We're safe. Is that a fair summary?
I think that's what some people would like people to believe. It's not true, however. There were very few people at the time when I led the Maastricht Rebellion who were prepared to actually engage in the debate at all about what would happen. And I hope you'll forgive me if I quote from what I said at the time, where I said that, if I can quote quickly, when monetary union collapses, as did the exchange rate mechanism, there will be widespread chaos with massive political and commercial instability throughout Europe and the rise of the far right as a serious danger. And the fact is that I very much agree, because I know this is a debate, but it doesn't mean to say you don't have a common ground with what John said about this question of confidence. But I would add one other thing too. I think it's a democratic crisis of confidence as well as in the economic situation. And I believe fundamentally that the reason we have to renegotiate all these treaties, which I think will come about when it collapses, and there is a question of what is a collapse. It's a bit like, what is a default? And I think that the collapse is when people recognize that what John said is true, that they no longer have confidence in it. The protests and the riots, for example, that are going on in Italy at the moment, which are turning into quite difficult language about the European Union and the European Commission, are engaged in what they describe at any rate as a fascist dictatorship, imposing requirements upon Italy, imposing requirements upon Greece, are all part and parcel of a reaction of young people, 47% in certainly in Greece and in Spain, and in the 30s in other parts of the European Union, where they've literally lost confidence in their governments. And actually, John is also right when he talks about the collapse of confidence which is beginning to emerge, for example, in America. I think there is a democratic problem for the whole world, which is why I would like to go back to small units working together in cooperation, renegotiate the treaties into an association of nation states, keep ahead of the curve, because I don't want an implosion any more than anybody else does. And yet, I think it's going to happen, and I believe the way to avoid it happening is to actually ensure that you get real democracy back into the system, allow the small businesses to have the oxygen to enable them to be able to generate the wealth, which is the word growth, which in the British context would also reduce the deficit. It's not going to come from printing money from the Bank of England, and it's not going to come from Eurobonds in Germany, in the ECB. And I fear that the two-tier arrangements which are now being proposed, which I know to be very serious, would mean that you have a greater Germany, if I can use that general expression, imposing conditions on other countries in return for being the paymaster, which would not be healthy, as I said in the Bundestag the other day, for Germany or for Europe or for the other countries. And I think the other part of Europe will tend to be more flexible, and yet, if bound by the treaties, will also create democratic tensions, because they'll be bound to a system where effectively there are two Europes, both of which are built on sand. It's an internal contradiction. Let's, for heaven's sake, get ahead of the curve.
I think it is important to analyse what might happen if the euro were to break up. I think if the euro were to break up, we probably wouldn't go back to an exchange rate mechanism. We would go back to possibly 27 different currencies. We'd have competitive devaluations. In other words, one country would try to get an advantage for its employees and its exports by devaluing its currencies unilaterally against the other currency. You would then probably have also the reintroduction of exchange controls. Money wouldn't flow freely within Europe anymore. People would have their separate currencies, and you'd not be allowed to take money out of your country without consent, which is what happened, which was what was the case prior to the 1970s. The result of that would be that money would be invested inefficiently. At the moment, freedom of movement of money does mean that, in theory at least, and in practice most of the time, the money goes to where it'll get the best return, which means that money is used more effectively. If we went back to 27 separate European economies, we'd have much more inefficiency. And at a time when the rest of the world is achieving great efficiency, and you have huge economies like China and India that are single economies, for Europe to break itself up into 27 economies and then hope to compete with these giants, I think would be impossible. In other words, we would accelerate, I think very substantially, the relative decline of Europe. That's probably going to happen anyway, but we would accelerate it by an order of magnitude. There's another point I think that I would respond to Bill about. That is, he referred to, and it's quite commonly a quite commonly used expression, Germany imposing conditions. Now, Germany imposing, those two words are in themselves enough to set a lot of people wild, because the idea of Germany imposing is in itself considered to be a bad thing. But if you actually think about what Germany is supposedly imposing, all it's imposing is common sense. It's saying to people, you shouldn't spend more than you're taking in revenue. You certainly should run up debts, but don't run up debts that are, twice your income or that are unsustainable. Make sure that your debts are sustainable. And also, don't rob future generations by running high rates of inflation, because all that inflation does is rob savers and robs future generations of what we're enjoying today. Now, this is what Germany is, in inverted commas, imposing, common sense. Yes, well, and I think the problem is others like the luxury of, stealth taxes. And the biggest and most effective stealth tax of all is printing money and inflation. Germany doesn't like stealth taxes. I don't like stealth taxes. And I think the disciplines that Germany is trying to get us all to agree to are actually quite sensible, particularly in a continent where the population is aging. We need to conserve our resources, not spend what we don't have.
Well, I think that's a very fair point, actually. And when I talk about imposing conditions, I wasn't thinking of it in a threatening manner. I really do, however, have to point out that as a result, as I said in the debate the other day in the House, of their nous and their commercial sense, they've managed to maintain unit labour costs over the last 10 years in Germany to 2%. The really extraordinary thing is that there isn't a single other country in the whole of the other 26 which has managed to keep it below 25%. And therefore the discipline that they've imposed, but it is also associated with an export-orientated and an investment policy, a foreign direct investment in other countries, using the Eastern and Central European countries in order to repatriate the profits from the companies that they've earned. And therefore, to that extent, when I say a greater Germany, it's not just that they're imposing, as it were, in my terms, political conditions and economic conditions, but they are also, through the two-tier fiscal union, actually going to have a much greater degree of control, because the majority voting system will depend on those countries voting with Germany when the issue of the single market comes up. And fiscal solidarity is going to mean that there will be a caucus vote. That is a matter of grave concern, because it will actually, if the European Union were to collapse with the collapse of the euro, then mean that you would have a continent which was not only theoretically divided by treaties into two Europes, but also into two blocks, one of which would be free trading and outside, which I would regard as a benefit. That would be what Britain would be involved in. And the other would be the far more concentrated, hardcore Europe, which would then operate on that basis. And if the euro did collapse, I think that's the direction in which it would go, which is the other side of the argument that Michael Sturmer puts when he argues in a pamphlet, and I was at a conference with him short time ago, that actually there's a lot to be said for Germany leaving the euro, because that is the other side of the coin.
I want to come in with some of the questions that we've been receiving from online debaters of members of Debating Europe. But before I get to those questions, Bill, I want to come back to this fragmentation of European currencies. We're in the Asian century, we think. What do you think our leverage as Europeans on the policymakers in Beijing is likely to be if we are fragmented in whatever pattern the fragmentation is? Because right now we're trying to persuade the Chinese that their own currency, the renminbi, is artificially cheap.
Well, the short answer is not much. That's my judgment, because I think that they have their own agenda and they will follow it. They're a highly centralized autocratic state, and I think they will continue to do whatever they think is in their interests. I may add, however, that I think that although this may not apply to some of the other countries in Europe, if there is fragmentation, and I believe there will be, then I think that the United Kingdom, as it happens, is very well placed to deal with the global trading arrangements which we would then engage in, re-engaging with the Commonwealth, re-engaging with particularly Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and Africa, where the Chinese, of course, are already making a lot of progress. And I believe that we would benefit enormously, as it happens, from that kind of fragmentation, because we would then be able to re-gear our trade with the rest of the world, which is running at a surplus of 7 billion a year at the moment. That's the rest of the world, as compared to Europe. And as it happens, with regard to Europe, in 1 year, this last year, the trade balance, or the trade deficit between ourselves and the other 26 member states has gone up from minus 14 billion to minus 53 billion, and these are Office of National Statistic figures. And with the Eurozone, bearing in mind the point about the fiscal union, our trade deficit has gone up from minus 4 billion in 2009 to minus 38 billion. That tells a lot.
But you're talking about we, the British.
I am indeed.
This is fog in channel, continent cut off.
Well, it isn't really, because, you see, I believe that we are continuously being told that actually the policies which are being developed in Europe are good for all of us, including the United Kingdom. And I make the very strong point that if they were to disaggregate the employment and social chapter and the rest of it, the employment laws, and allow the rest of Europe to deregulate, then the whole of Europe would benefit. But they seem to be incapable of doing it, and therefore it would be my view that we should be disaggregating ourselves from that relationship, because we have to look after ourselves. But I think Europe will benefit from pursuing the same kind of policies.
I think it's interesting that I think the figures that Bill quotes about the huge trade deficit and service export deficit that Britain has with the rest of Europe suggests that Britain has made a mistake in wanting to have an independent monetary policy and keep its own currency, because it has lost out in the trade with the countries that have a single currency. One of the arguments that has been made was that by having one's own currency, one can devalue and therefore export more. Well, what has happened? Britain has devalued relative to the euro, and it's exporting less. So, in fact, the arguments haven't worked in your favour at all in this situation.
Well, I would say the reason for that, very quickly, is that we are actually trading extremely successfully with the rest of the world, and therefore it follows that if we can do that, we could have done it with the EU, but unfortunately, as far as the EU is concerned, we're under very severe restrictions with regard to the stranglehold of European employment and regulations which inhibit.
But I mean,
It's
it
the
doesn't
same,
make
by the
sense.
way.
If you can export to the rest of the world using those rules,
No.
why can't you export
No,
to the
those
continent
those
using
ru-
those
no,
rules?
those rules
The rules
don't-
are the same within the
John,
UK.
no, the rules are no. We are confined when we're dealing with the European Union within the rules that are prescribed as respects the legal order of the European Union. When it comes to trading with the rest of the world, we have the freedom to be able to do it on our own terms.
But you're not telling us that you're sending shoddy goods to the rest of the world
I'm not saying
and trying to export higher quality goods to the continent.
What I am
don't think-
saying is that we've got a much freer trading arrangement with the rest of the world than we have with the European Union. And actually, we haven't got time to go into it, but if you actually look at the imbalance between ourselves, for example, and Germany, you would see that there is a massive imbalance in our relationship between ourselves and that country in particular.
I want to move on from square tomatoes or whatever it is that we're talking about here. And first of all, open up to around the table and invite any questions. But I want to start off with one of the questions that have come in from a Debating Europe participant, which seems to me to be a very fair one. And is essentially, are we running behind the crisis the whole time? Because the question that I've got is, why do we come up with measures like the EFSF, the bailout fund, only when the crisis threatens to overwhelm everything? So in effect, this person is asking, are we behind the curve the whole time? Is the Eurozone crisis being badly managed, John?
I think the reality is that the policymakers of today in Europe and in the rest of the world are dealing with problems that no politicians have had to deal with since the late 1920s and the early 1930s. So not only it's our grandparents as politicians who were the last ones to deal with this problem. So it's no wonder that people are completely unprepared for the situation we're now facing, where banks have lost confidence in one another, people have lost confidence in government debt. We don't have a gold standard anymore since 1971. So there is no reliable unit of value. And the absence of a reliable unit of value has led to this breakdown in confidence. And this is something for which people are completely unprepared. And it is true, I think, that the policymakers are stumbling forward belatedly, coming forward with solutions to problems under pressure and long later than they should have done. And in a sense, I think what we're seeing is, and it's not just confined to Europe, but the world at large, we're seeing a huge intellectual failure. A failure of the policy-making elite, a failure of the economics profession to provide contingency ideas to deal with the sort of problems we're now facing. Now, I think we are putting the pieces in place. And unfortunately, let us not beat up Europe too much. Remember, the Americans didn't put TARP in place. It was voted down in Congress. And then over the weekend, there was a huge panic on the markets and there was about to be complete collapse. And the following week, Congress came back and voted the TARP in, and it did stabilize the banking situation. Unfortunately, because we're unprepared for the problems, we're in a situation that you have to go right to the brink and indeed almost over it before the policymakers summon up the will to do what's necessary. And I think we have to be self-critical. We have to be self-critical as Europeans that we didn't, in designing the euro, think of all the things we ought to have thought of. And in that sense, people like Bill have a point. They have pointed to they pointed out at the time to some of the difficulties. It didn't point to all of them. But if we didn't listen and didn't make provision, that is something for which we must take some responsibility as a Euro enthusiast. And I'm an enthusiastic Euro enthusiast. But I think I've got to admit...
This is what I accused David Cameron of being
I know,
at the end of the other day.
I would welcome it as a compliment. Bill.
Well, I understand that. Actually, the answer to the question, to my mind, is there was a failure to keep ahead of the curve, and I think the questioner is absolutely right on that. I would say that one of the reasons for that is that instead of making policy in the freer context of a parliament which makes laws in line with what the electors are asked to vote for in general elections, actually the policies that are made are all constrained by the legal framework which is prescribed by the treaties. And because that is a sort of rule of law, it means that the options for making the changes are much less flexible than they would be in a much freer nation-state arrangement. But I do believe very strongly that we need to have something, in my opinion, like an EFTA plus with political cooperation, which would enable everybody to benefit from working together in Europe, but also having certain red lines where, to put it bluntly, I would reintroduce the veto, where it was clear that in the interests of certain countries, it was just simply not possible to implement it because the people of those countries would not accept it. And I think that a lot of the protests, the riots, the high unemployment, the rest of it, is going to move people more in that direction.
So the solution to this political failure is not more Europe, it's less Europe.
I'm afraid, I'm afraid, I'm glad to be able to say that that is what I believe to be the case, and that's really why back in 1990, some of us, and why I led the rebellion against the Maastricht Treaty, because I thought that the consequence of this, with the increase in majority voting getting into the areas of European government and economics and the Maastricht criteria and all the other things that went with it, we would not be able to run our economy with the flexibility that we needed. And by the way, the same applied to other countries as well. This is not fog in the channel. Actually, I believe it's bad for Europe, and I think it's bad for the UK as well.
Where would Ireland have been with less Europe?
Well, I'm approaching this as a European, of course, and not just solely as an Irish person. I mean, basically, the problem is the opposite, I think, to as it is posed by Bill. Look at the messing we've had in Europe over the last 2 years in trying to come up with solutions. And why have we had all this messing and this delay? Because we've had the veto. We've been dealing with these matters intergovernmentally. They're not provided for in the treaties. And one country can hold everything up. Slovakia can hold things up. France can hold things up. Germany can hold things up. Ireland can hold things up, so long as you're dealing with things intergovernmentally. And my preference would be if we could deal with these issues by the traditional community method, where the European Commission comes up with the proposal that it thinks is broadly acceptable to all 17 members of the Euro, and then that's voted through by qualified majority vote in the European Council and in the European Parliament in the way that it makes its decisions. I think you'd have more coherent and quicker decision making in that way. Going back to a Europe of vetoes is going back to the past, and back to a past that was not satisfactory.
One quick point on that. It is that very past which was created, in my view, as a policy of misjudgment, is the reason we are where we are now. And I believe that if we had actually, as the 1971 White Paper said, and when Edward Heath wrote it for the UK, we will retain the veto because it is not only necessary to protect British national interests, but the interesting words he added were, and to do otherwise would also endanger the very fabric of the European community itself. And I think that's where we've ended up.
It's fair to say that your misgivings about Maastricht were shared by Helmut Kohl at the time, but from a rather different standpoint. He said, without a political union, it's a house of cards. Now, I've got some more questions from Debating Europe participants, but first I've got some interventions from around the table. I think Ana Gomez from the European Parliament and also Shada Islam from Friends of Europe.
I'd like to ask John, don't you think that what Commissioner Almunia said today, that indeed the failure to address these imbalances, macroeconomic imbalances that have only been aggravated since we created the euro, has been also at the heart of this crisis, namely within the Eurozone. The fact that the euro has not the conditions for the performing as it should be. And has indeed actually Jacques Delors, a long time ago, had identified.
Could I say yes? I very strongly agree with that. I think the country that I'm most familiar with, Ireland, and I think Spain as well, are two countries which had reasonably good public finances. The problem wasn't with our debt or our deficits. The problem was with the level of borrowing and with the huge current account deficits that we were running up as a result of borrowing money on an unsustainable level. Now, there wasn't provision in the Stability and Growth Pact for effective intervention to deal with that sort of imbalance. There was a provision for dealing with budget deficits, but not for huge current account or trade deficits. And the result of that lack of enforcement was, the lack of control on that, was the crisis in which Ireland and Spain have found themselves. In other countries like Greece, it was a different type of problem, which was provided for in the arrangements, but unfortunately the statistics produced by Greece were false, and that caused that difficulty. But I agree basically with everything that you said, Anna.
I should add that Anna is from the country that put the P in pigs, not the S.
Oh, sorry, it's your brain.
Could I just make one comment?
Yes.
You see, I believe there's a lot of the problems come from too much debt in the individual countries. And I mean, although the figures in the UK have been put at $1 trillion, there are many of us who believe that actually, if you include other off-balance sheet matters, it's nearer $3.5 trillion. So there is a real question of credibility about the level of debt in the first place. Why is that debt there? Because a lot of it comes from paying an enormous amount into the public sector. Now, I'm not against the idea of having a public sector at all, but the problem is that if you haven't got the money coming into your exchequer from the small and medium-sized and other businesses, then you haven't got the money to pay for that. So everything ultimately depends on a successful private enterprise. And I'm afraid to say that I think, if I may say with respect, in Spain and in other European countries, a lot of these laws have been brought in, working time directive, length of time people work, paternity pay, this kind of thing and the other, tend to be very, very much, if I may say, socialist-inspired ideas, which may be good in theory, some would think, but actually aren't affordable in the context of a modern economy in the European dimension.
Let's go to Shadar Islam.
The euro lives on a global stage. The banks of India, China, the central bank of the US, they all hold reserve currencies. Euro is a major reserve currency. So if there were a collapse, it would actually create chaos on the world markets as well. So I wanted your opinion on that. And a second point is there's a lot of talk about China coming in and saving the euro by buying euro bonds, sovereign debt and the rest. I was wondering if you could comment on those two questions.
Well, if I could just quickly say, I don't think China is going to. I mean, I think there's been some suggestion that they might help the Greeks out a bit, but it doesn't seem to have got much further than some talk for a start. But I think on the general question, yes, certainly it is true that there would be an enormous knock-on effect as regards to the rest of the world if the euro collapsed. But I have to say that there's always a silver lining to every cloud. And I believe that the consequence of the jolt that would create, which I believe is as much political as economic, would mean that people would then have to start saying, well, we really have got to restructure our attitudes towards the European institutional arrangements to make them more democratic and at the same time more realistic.
I think you are right that there would be contagion. What we're seeing, in a sense, is not just a crisis of a currency or a crisis of banking. It's a crisis of interdependence and globalization. We have become so dependent on one another now in the world that one part of the world having a major difficulty, say in its banking system, creates contagion across the whole world and does so almost over a weekend. And the difficulty is that we haven't got political arrangements that are swift enough to deal with the problem. We haven't got it in the G20, we haven't got it in the IMF, and yes, we haven't got it in the European Union either. But I would argue that the European Union is slightly better at dealing with this sort of problem and slightly more evolved in dealing with the consequences of interdependence than are the arrangements in any other part of the world. And I think that what we have got to do is remedy the design flaws in the existing project. Once we have done that, I think we will have then something that will be an example to the rest of the world.
Sorry, just one thing. I do fear that actually more emphasis on these huge institutions as the saviours of the problem is part of the problem and not the solution. I actually believe very strongly that we want to scale things down so that actually people can have a direct impact through their voting systems on what's going on. And what John is describing, I think, is, and it's something which is gaining currency, is the idea that if you have bigger institutional G20 decisions, etc., that is going to solve the problem. I think it's going to make it much worse. It's going to be further away from the man and the woman in the street.
I'd like to take the global aspect of this question a little further. I'm interested to know, at a time of multiple global crises in terms of still food prices, climate change, also in terms of energy, what do you think a breakdown of the euro would mean, in particular for the poorest and most vulnerable countries of the world? I think arguably countries like Sierra Leone, Haiti and many others are still facing a much larger crisis than the European Union.
I think the first people to suffer from a collapse of confidence in the banking system and in sovereign debt, which would possibly lead to a break-up in the euro, would obviously be people who have savings of any kind, because they would find that their savings are wiped out. So this would disproportionately affect older people who have had the opportunity to accumulate savings. I'm not sure that the effect on the underdeveloped countries would be proportionately enormous. I think the effect would be greater in the more prosperous countries. The more prosperous one is, the more savings one has, the more one has to lose from a collapse in confidence in money. So the more money you have, the more you lose if money ceases to be fungible.
I would tend to agree with that. I think it would be a terrible thing if there was a massive collapse. It would have contagion. It would affect other parts of the world. And I'm one of those who campaigned for the reduction of third world debt. I led the Jubilee campaign in Parliament for the reduction of third world debt, because I really did think that those countries themselves should never have been put in that position or got themselves into that position. But actually, I think that John is right, that it will be the more prosperous countries that will really feel not just a chill wind, but an absolutely chaotic situation. And that's why I'm so anxious that we should now get ahead of the curve rapidly. And I don't think the G20 arrangements are capable of achieving that.
Well, I think the next question has come in from Debating Europe. I doubt that you're going to agree with one another. The question is, should we seek to reinforce the EU's mandate on the Eurozone crisis by insisting that each nation hold a referendum as to whether to remain with the EU or leave? Both debaters have interesting views on referenda. Bill, let's start with you.
Well, the short answer is yes, and in fact, I've given an interview to the BBC yesterday in which I have strongly advocated that we should have a referendum with the question, given the fact that the current situation, in my view, in Europe is untenable, that we should have a referendum on two parts question. The first part is, should we leave the European Union? And the other is, should we renegotiate into trade and political cooperation? I think that we're beyond critical. I think it's absolutely essential that we go back to the people. All our parliamentary parties are divided. There is a chaotic situation. There are no answers coming out of the European Union to solve the problems. I think that the European Union, as it is at the moment, is damaging the British economy very substantially. And I think that it is time that we had a referendum, and I've made that entirely clear. And by the way, looking at John and the Irish referendum, and of course recalling the Dutch and the French and the Danish, every time they have a referendum, what do? They pump a huge amount of money in what I call propaganda to ensure that they spend disproportionately enough to ensure that they change the name of the game. I don't call that democracy. And I do think that actually a referendum is a very, very good thing. But I noticed that Mr. Kenny is saying, let's not have a treaty because in Ireland we don't want a referendum.
But it should be added, John, before that it is generally thought of as an assailable gospel amongst British political correspondents. No British general election has ever been won on leave the EU platform?
I think the situation is beginning to shift in a different direction now. Curiously enough, only last week there was a YouGov poll in which for the first time 51% said they wanted to leave. That's the first serious indication. But I think actually my preference would be for a substantial renegotiation, because I do not regard this as a fog in the Channel issue. I actually think the whole of Europe is suffering from what's going on, which is why I would like to see renegotiation of the treaties, but not tinkering and not nibbling. I think it needs to be a radical structural change, bringing democracy back within the nation states, but also working together.
Well, traditionally, Britain, and as some of you will know, Ireland used to be part of the United Kingdom. Britain believed in parliamentary democracy, in representative democracy. I would tend to go with Edmund Burke, who took the view that... Indeed. And Edmund Burke took the view that Parliament should decide these matters. And I think it's quite shocking